So there are 2 times in the Torah where it speaks about the mitzvah the mitzvah of loving a ger. A ger is someone who converted to Judaism. So there's a mitzvah in the Torah to love a ger. And the question is, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean that is it a separate mitzvah, or is that mitzvah an additional mitzvah on top of, because we know that there's a mitzvah. If you look at the Rambam says it very clearly that there are two separate mitzvahs. Now, the reasoning is not so clear exactly why. All we see is that Hashem loves a ger more, so you should love a ger more. Why do we have to love a ger more than extra? Why is there an extra mitzvah to love a ger? Because a ger has left his home, he's left his family, he's gone away from everything he knows, he's put himself in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position, and for life, he's changed his entire life, and he's brought himself under Tachas Kanfei Hashchina. He's brought himself under the wings of Hashem, and therefore this person is deserving of extra love. That is basically what is said. Now, if we know the situation these days, there's many Baruch Hashem, many people who are baalei tshuva, and they are, you could say, in a similar type of situation, right? Because they can leave their families. And they come to, they absorb themselves in a completely separate community. And the question, therefore, is, should we extend the mitzvah of Ahavtas Ager to a baal tshuva?
Okay. So first of all, I'd like to make a distinction between hashkafa and halacha. Often we have Jewish books on Musar and Jewish thought, where we say certain things, we find a verse in the Torah and we apply it to certain cases for how one ought to behave. And then there's halacha, where someone is legally binded to behave a certain way. When it comes to hashkafa, it's a lot more loose. You can translate one thing into another thing a lot more loosely, but there still is a win and lose element to it. If, let's say, someone were to apply the mitzvah of loving a convert very loosely, very liberally, then you end up taking away from the mitzvah for converts, because you're applying it to others who are not converts. So it becomes almost meaningless to love the convert, because it's not only converts, it's also many other groups of people who are similar. On the other hand, if some people are similar to converts, it's unfair kindness to show a convert if other people have a similar struggle. So there is a balance. But this is all in hashkafa. As far as halacha goes, for it to be a part of the actual halacha, it has to be legally binding. So fairness is not really an important part of the equation. It's what's legally binding is important. So you could have a very rich almana, you could have a very rich widow, and it's still a mitzvah to love them. You could have a very poor non-widow, the mitzvah of loving a widow doesn't apply to them. So the technicalities of the law are different to the hashkafa behind the law. When we spoke about this mitzvah of converts, do they apply to immigrants or not? We mentioned the Sefer HaChinuch, that he writes that from this mitzvah we should learn not only for a convert, but also for people who come from another land and they came to where we live. That's it. So we have a mitzvah to have mercy on them, because they too are like converts by us, because they come from a different place. Yeah. When we spoke about this here, I made it clear that this is not a question whether we should accept them or not. That's one question. If they're already here,
I didn't say anything.
Right. So they're.
No. At what point, sorry if I may.
Yes, please.
If we are saying that we honor them, specially respect, at what point? The day they convert, during the process,
So the Zohar Rakir was a book written by the Rashbats, and actually before him already in Barcelona, he compiled he was a poet of some sort, an early rabbi, and he wrote a poem with all the mitzvot. And in he counts the mitzvah of loving a convert. It seems as though the mitzvah to him wasn't to love them once they've converted. It's the mitzvah to help, love them while they're converting. Yeah. Now there's a debate amongst people who count the 613 mitzvot. Right? Now there are more than 613 mitzvot. So how do we count the mitzvot? So one debate is, if you have a mitzvah twice, and it's the same mitzvah, just the once it applies to everyone, the other time it applies to specific people. Do we count it as two separate mitzvot or not? So Rabbi Yerucham Fishel Perla, who was a great rabbi, European rabbi, so he believed that according to Rabbi Saadia Gaon, there's no such thing that the Torah would command one thing for one people and another thing for other people. So he works around it to make every mitzvah replicated twice that applies. So for example, when it speaks about a convert, not to oppress a convert, he understands it's referring to a non-Jew who lives in Israel. It's the same word, ger tzedek and ger toshav. The Torah doesn't specify which ger it's talking about. So it's referring to a non-Jewish convert in Israel. And he works around it to make sure that the Torah doesn't. So v'ahavta re'echa kamocha is another example. How could you love the ger if you already have to love him because of v'ahavta re'echa kamocha? So he says, obviously this ger is also not already commanded in v'ahavta re'echa kamocha. He has a whole thesis around this. The people who study the Taryag mitzvot, but what I was saying is that there are opinions like the Rashbats and Ria Barceloni, who say that the mitzvah is not to love them once they've converted,
Right.
but it's while they're converting to convert them. That's the mitzvah. The traditional understanding is that there's a mitzvah to love them once they've converted, and after they've converted, there's two mitzvot to love them. One, v'ahavta re'echa kamocha, and we spoke once over here before if v'ahavta re'echa kamocha only applies to Jews or if it applies to non-Jews also. And that's a debate. Most rabbis seem to think that it applies only to Jews, but I mentioned Rabbi Mendel Kasher, amongst many other rabbis, who believe that it applies to non-Jews equally. There's a Sefer Brit by Hurwitz, by Pinchas Hurwitz, that he says it obviously applies to non-Jews also. In any case, that's for another issue. Some people understand it to be once he's converted to love him. Some people say the mitzvah is to love him while he's in the process of converting. Yeah, so it's a debate. So to someone who comes from another land to where we live, even if they're not converts, the Sefer HaChinuch writes that there's a mitzvah which we should learn from the mitzvah to have mercy on them. Now the Minchat Chinuch comments, and he explains that this is not halacha, this is miderech hamusar. This is hashkafa. I mentioned there's a difference between sometimes we have hashkafic thoughts, sometimes we have halacha. So halacha, it only applies to converts, but hashkafa, it applies also to people from a foreign land. Now when we spoke over here, a few classes ago, we spoke about immigrants. I mentioned that the Pele Yoetz, Rabbi Eliezer Papo, he argued that it applies halachically to converts, and then a whole bunch of rabbis following him seem to apply it to immigrants even halachically. And the argument for this was because the Torah gives a reason, love the convert, because you were gerim in Egypt, you were strangers in Egypt. We never converted to the Egyptian faith. We were gerim as strangers in Egypt. So the mitzvah to love a convert is because we were strangers in Egypt. So it applies to anyone who were strangers in Egypt. So the argument could be made that the mitzvah of loving a convert applies not just to converts, but applies to anyone in a foreign land, anyone who's a stranger. So the example in Pele Yoetz was Ashkenazi in a Sephardi community or a Sephardi in an Ashkenazi community. And later, Rabbi Ephraim Rosing, who was a great Ashkenazi rabbi, he was from Lithuania, but he was a rabbi of Hasidim and Lithuanians, because in many villages they lived together, the Hasidim and Lithuanians. Then when he moved to Israel, Rav Kook, who was at the time the chief rabbi, he sent a letter greeting him and saying a big Cham's coming to town. And so he was a rabbi who's in the Ashkenazi world respected by almost every community. He got a letter simultaneously from the Gedolei Hador of the Lithuanian community, but also of Hasidim, even from Chabad. Both the previous Chabad Rebbe, the Rebbe Rayatz, and the one before him, the Rebbe Rashab, sent letters to him requesting him to do certain things. So he was very popular amongst many different groups. And when he quoted this, so he writes that the mitzvah applies not only to a person who come from another religion, who converted to Judaism, but also to different Jewish sects. And he says, for example, when someone from one group comes to a Chabad show, so the Chabad people will tell him, go away, go to your own group, because this is for Chabad, and you should go to your own group, which I thought was ironic, because today, this was, 100 years ago, 100 years. Today, Chabad stereotypically is the group, anyone can come. But back then, if you're not Chabad, you're not welcome here. So I thought that was funny. So the mitzvah, according to all these rabbis, applies to non-immigrants also. Now, Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch wrote something very interesting, and here he has Tshuvot v'Hanagot, his responsums, and he has a responsum about a female baal tshuva, baalat tshuva, and he writes in this responsum at the end, he quotes the Sefer HaChinuch, and he writes, while the Sefer HaChinuch wasn't halachic, however, a baal tshuva, about a stranger who comes to your land, however, a baal tshuva who leaves his family and comes and joins the Orthodox circles, such a person, even halachically, you have to treat him like a ger. Now this intrigued me. This made me very interesting because a ger, the Torah is referring to a convert who's not Jewish and becomes Jewish. And the Sefer HaChinuch writes that we could look at the reason of the mitzvah and study from the mitzvah to people who are similar, right? Now finding a case of a baal tshuva which is slightly more similar, right, still seemingly shouldn't be a part of the halacha. So how does Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch say, yes, the Minchat Sefer HaChinuch's case of a stranger in your land, that's not halachic, but if I'll find a more similar case, that would be halachic. There's a principle in the Talmud If let's say I borrow money from you, and you say, okay, I'll lend you money, but I want to make sure you pay me back, so give me your coat. Yeah. So I give my coat, and then when I pay back the money, he'll give me the coat back. Yeah, standard borrowing procedure. Then comes the night and it's cold, and I don't wanna be very cold at night. So I go and I say, hey, can you give me my coat back? So the Torah says until the sun comes, which means if I need my coat because it's cold, he has to give me back the coat, and in the morning I have to give him back. When I borrow money, it's still his responsibility. When I borrow money and I give him something to ensure my payment, like collateral, it's his responsibility to make sure whenever I need it, I could use it. So typically, let's say when you borrow money and we think of, okay, I'll give you collateral, like I'll give you my watch as collateral. Typically speaking, people say, okay, this is my watch, and when you pay back, I'll give it back. But until you don't pay me the money, it's going to be by me. But the Torah says no. When you borrow money and you take something for collateral, he still has the right to use it whenever he wants to use it. So the Torah says that you should not take collateral from an almana, from a widow. So Talmud understands this to be, because what is it going to look like? The widow, she's a single older woman, and you took her coat, and at night she comes by to pick up her coat, and in the morning she comes by to give the coat back. People are going to see this, the neighbors are going to see this, and it looks, no one's going to assume, oh yeah, she borrowed money and this is the collateral. People are going to see her coming in the morning and at night, and it looks bad. So therefore, from a widow, you should not take collateral. There are other reasons also, like the Sefer HaChinuch writes to have mercy on a widow and things like that. And the Talmud has a debate. What if she's a very rich widow who won't need to come by at night and take her coat back? In that case, the reason doesn't apply. So could you, from a rich widow, could you take collateral? So the debate is, when there's a reason for a mitzvah, the Torah said don't do this to a widow, and there's a reason. What's the reason? Because she's going to come by at night. Do we then amend the halacha if the reason changes? Like a rich person, the reason no longer applies. Do we amend the halacha? So this is a debate in the Talmud, and we follow the opinion, lo darshinan tama dikra. We do not change the halacha. That's how we follow the opinion. In the Rishonim, you'll find stipulation amongst individuals who might have not agreed with this principle, or at least not always. But the halacha has been accepted unanimously today that we do not care about the reason. Even if the reason doesn't apply, the mitzvah still applies.
Would you say that Reform Judaism takes that to an extreme on the other side?
I don't have expertise in Reform. It generally seems they don't really care about halacha. I don't know. Like I'll give an example. I'll give an example. I'll give an example.
You're talking about the Reform rabbis, but the Reform.
No, I'm talking
leaders.
about the movement.
Right.
I'll give an example. Asher B'tzara Leuterbach. Yeah, this is back when Reform studied. So it's not Moses Mendelssohn, but it's back, he was in the early 1900s, a rabbi in Cincinnati. That's where Reform was very big. And on the Hebrew Books website, they have a kuntras. Hebrew Books, so you find a lot of Jewish books online. And they have a kuntras Shvirat Etzem. And I'm going a bit off topic here, but I think this is interesting. So Asher B'tzara Leuterbach was a major Reform rabbi. And almost everything he wrote, right, had something disingenuous about it. He's written, like for example, once he has a tshuva about having renovations in the shul on Shabbos. And the tshuva basically was, if you're Orthodox, you're allowed to, but if you're Reform, you have to be machmir, which is ludicrous. Anyways, he has a whole bunch of things like that, very disingenuous. So he has one about Shviras Etzem. So he shows you a whole bunch of contradictions between different Tanaic sources.
Just to translate.
Tanaic or...
No, Shviras Etzem.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to get there. I spoke about, in my show this week, we spoke about this mitzvah, actually. It was from this week's parsha. The Korban Pesach, when you sacrifice the Korban Pesach, you're supposed to not break the bone, you're not supposed to take off meat. And there are contradictions amongst sources from the Tanaim, from the Mishnah period, about the details of this mitzvah. So he quotes this question, and then he quotes Rav Nachman in the Talmud's answer, and he says, oh, that's a doichak, so I'll give you the correct answer. So when I was reading this, I didn't know it was Reform. And I was like, Rav Nachman's answer is doichak? I've never seen such a thing. And then I Googled the guy, and I realized he was Reform. Anyways, he's a funny guy. His son spent a lot of time writing about Tanakh. So the second generation no longer even cares about halacha anymore. They're just reading Tanakh. And in any case, where was I? Oh yeah. So there's a debate in the Talmud. If the reason doesn't apply, do we then amend the halacha? So we follow the opinion we do not amend the halacha, and therefore even for a rich woman, a widow, you should not take collateral for a loan. So if the Torah says to love a convert, even if the reason is because they're a stranger in a foreign land, right? Even if that's the reason, the Torah says a convert. How could we then say, well, it applies also to a baal tshuva? Yeah, is the question clear? How can Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch says it applies to a baal tshuva if the Torah says a ger?
And we don't. What's the word?
Lo darshinan ta'amad ikra. We don't care about the reason behind the mitzvah, or the Torah says that's what we do. If you're asking us, I'll mention this because I wrote an article about this very question, and it should be published this week in a rabbinic journal. And there are two reasons for. This is a topic of what he's asking. There are two reasons to love a convert. One of them would apply to a baal tshuva, which is that they came from foreign land, their distance, don't feel comfortable. But there's another reason. The other reason is they came under the wing of Shekhinah. The Rambam writes they came under the wing of the Shekhinah. Does that apply to a baal tshuva? So in the Talmud there's a story with Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish was originally a bandit. He was like a gang leader. And then Rabbi Yochanan made him religious. And then Rabbi Yochanan was debating about certain utensils with Reish Lakish. And then Reish Lakish spoke about that's how this utensil is used. So Rabbi Yochanan said, oh, well, you came from bandits. It makes sense you would know how to use this weapon, right? So he got very insulted. He said, why did I become religious? Over there they called me leader of the bandits. Over here they called me leader of the bandits. So Rabbi Yochanan answers, because I brought you close under the wing of the Shekhinah. So he uses that term of nichnas tachat kanfi Shekhinah about baal tshuvas. So it could be argued that the Rambam's reason applies to a baal tshuva also. I want to finish just with the final justification of Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch's reasoning about the widow. There's a debate in Shulchan Aruch and the commentaries. Who is a widow? Is a divorced woman a widow? Yeah, so it's a debate. Now the Torah says.
Obviously, the question is not is she a widow. The question is do the laws of a widow apply to her?
Yeah, when the Torah says don't take collateral from a widow, does it apply to it? There's a mitzvah to not oppress a widow and an orphan. There's a Rashi who says that it's not just an orphan; it's every person. Now there's a debate if that means every person or if it means every person who is like a widow. And now the consensus is that it only applies to orphans and widows, but there are quite a number of rabbis who say it applies to everyone, including Rashi. There's an opinion in the Mechilta like that. It's a very big conversation. But the mitzvah of taking collateral from them, that only applies to a widow, and because we don't look at the reason of the mitzvah. The Torah says a widow, so it means a widow. Now if this is the prototype, this mitzvah is the prototype that we don't care about the reason. It says in the Torah, even a widow, so even if they're rich, even if they're poor. So how can the on Shulchan Aruch people say that applies also to a divorced woman? So there's a difference between the reason of a mitzvah and the parameters of the mitzvah. The Torah says a widow, right? The parameters of widow can be broadened, what a widow includes. But the reason of the mitzvah is that she doesn't look like something bad when they come to pick up. That reasoning wouldn't amend the halacha. But to broaden the definitions or to minimize definitions of what a widow is, that we're entitled to do. If we believe the Torah didn't just mean a widow, it meant other things also. Now the Minchat Chinuch says that while there's a debate about a widow when it comes to giving them collateral, about the mitzvah of not oppressing a widow, over there everyone agrees it includes a divorced woman. Why? Because you already have Rashi who says it applies to every person. You already have opinions who say it applies to everyone anyways. So by collateral, you could say it's a debate. But over here that you have anyways an argument to be made that applies to everyone, you could say that it means also a divorced woman. So even those people who say, like the Shach, who say it only applies to a widow, in this mitzvah, that would include a divorced woman. So what I proposed in the article I published was that this is what Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch was thinking. About a foreigner that comes to our country, you're right, he's from a foreign land. But you can't apply nichnas tachat kanfei Shekhinah. He didn't come under the wings of the Shekhinah. So you can't apply that reasoning to a foreigner, and therefore the mitzvah wouldn't literally apply to them. But a baal tshuva has both. He left his family. There's an Arik Einstein song, Hu Chazar B'Tshuva, and discusses today it's not like that anymore, Baruch Hashem, but it used to be that when someone became religious, the parents would no longer have any association with the kids. They were very anti-religious, and the parents would say, okay, I have no more affiliation with you. So someone who became religious really sacrificed his world, and he went and joined the new world. So he really is like a convert, and also he's nichnas tachat kanfei Shekhinah. I mentioned the Talmud with Rabbi Yochanan referring to Reish Lakish as nichnas tachat kanfei Shekhinah. Also Rabbi Yonah.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think that even today, first of all, there are still scenarios that does happen.
Yeah, definitely.
So.
Yeah, and not only that, but even in situations where it doesn't happen, there are people. even if their family embraces them and loves what they're doing, they're not able to join their family for Friday night dinners.
Yes,
they're not able to be there for Shabbat. They're not able to be included in many family events and so on and so forth. Even if the family is very welcoming of their change. So I would say that that's very much still the case today.
I mentioned last time I spoke about immigrants, and also in my article I mentioned this, that the argument could be made that autistic people are included in immigrants because they always feel like, even if they're from here, they always feel like strangers and not. So the argument could be made that it applies even to autistic people. So if you've got an autistic baal tshuva,
extra. Right.
we see this from Moshe Rabbeinu because he refers to himself as a stranger. So we see this idea when people even in their own land could be considered like strangers. Yeah, the argument could be made that it's a mindset. It's not, if he actually leaves and it's hard to evaluate at what point does someone become pirish mimashpachto. It has to be pirish. Leave. In any case, the argument could be made that even although with someone from a foreign land, right? So we wouldn't broaden the definition and say, okay, he's included. But with a baal tshuva, that you have both reasons. Maybe over here, even although the Peleot says it about someone who leaves from a foreign land and we don't accept him, those who don't accept him might accept him in this case, where the Rambam who says, Nichnas tachat kanfi hashchina, that would apply here. Just before I finish, I wanted to mention something fascinating I saw. They found manuscripts. They found it actually online. What they did was they digitized all the libraries, all the books they found. And then people can go online and start going through the books. And they found pages of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch Harav, handwriting with what's seemingly a Mahadura Batra. The Alter Rebbe himself later amended it, and students wrote it down, and the Hasidim wrote down their version of the Shulchan Aruch handwritten. And they found on Siman Kuf Nun Hey, Siman Kuf Nun Vav, certain halachot where the Alter Rebbe seemingly added later additions to the Shulchan Aruch. And on Siman Kuf Nun Vav, Siman Kuf Nun Hey, there's a long Magen Avraham with a whole bunch of laws about Ahavat Re'im and these kind of things, and Ahavat Hager. And the Alter Rebbe over there, in this additional thing, they printed it a few years ago. It's a very new thing. He writes, loving the convert. The Rambam, he quotes the Rambam literally. There's 2 mitzvot. So he quotes the Rambam. Besides Ahavat Re'ach, he also fulfilled the mitzvah of Ahavat Re'im. But he adds, the Rambam writes that came under the wing of the Shekhinah. He adds, who came from a foreign land and came under the land of the Shekhinah. So he added Rashi to the Rambam. Now, the people on the bottom who republished this, Rabbi Elashvili, so he explained this means that if someone converts but didn't come from a foreign land, the mitzvah doesn't apply to them. I don't think that's mukhrach. I don't think you have to say that. I think you could argue it means that you have 2 opinions. You've got Rashi and the Rambam. The Rashi says you have to love them if they came from a foreign land. The Rambam says you have to love them because they came under the wings of the Shekhinah. So the Alter Rebbe wanted to include both to show you that even if someone isn't a convert, just from coming from a foreign land, there is a me'ain of the mitzvah. It's like you kind of fulfilling the mitzvah, like the Sefer HaChinuch writes. So therefore, the argument could be made by a baal tshuva that has both. It's a proper mitzvah to love them. And with that, I conclude my theory.